The morning of February 20th, 1945, arrived with a particular kind of dread. Up in the northern sector of Iwo Jima, Japanese defenders peered out from their fortified positions and spotted something approaching through the haze of volcanic ash. American tanks. But these weren't ordinary armor rolling across the black sand. The first thing the Japanese gunners noticed was the smoke. Black smoke, thick and oily, trailing behind the vehicles as they advanced. Not the grey smoke of battle damage or engine strain, something else entirely. The tanks kept coming, their turrets swiveling toward the concrete bunkers that dotted the landscape. The gunners waited for the familiar bark of a 75mm cannon. Instead, they heard a sound they'd never encountered before. A mechanical hiss like pressurized air suddenly released. In that moment, everything changed. A massive stream of burning fuel erupted across the volcanic terrain, spanning nearly 150 yards in a single arc of orange and flame. It engulfed the neighboring pillbox in an instant, a torrent of thickened napalm that incinerated everything in its path. The screams from inside lasted only seconds before silence reclaimed the island. Japanese soldiers grabbed their field telephones, hands shaking as they reported what they'd witnessed. 8 modified Sherman tanks, 8 vehicles equipped with flamethrowers, 8 weapons unlike anything the Japanese had ever encountered on any battlefield. What these defenders didn't understand was that they were facing something unprecedented in Pacific warfare. These machines represented months of secret development, thousands of engineering hours, and innovations that would fundamentally transform combat on this island and beyond. Back in Hawaii, at Schofield Barracks 5 months earlier, Colonel George Unmarked had assembled an unusual team. A man with 44 years of military service, Unmarked commanded the Army Chemical Warfare Service's most classified project in the Central Pacific. His assignment was straightforward but daunting. Create weapons capable of neutralizing Japanese fortifications that had proven immune to conventional bombing, shelling, and standard tank fire. Unmarked's initial group was small, just the 43rd Chemical Laboratory Company. But he understood that the challenge ahead demanded exceptional talent from multiple branches. He requisitioned 25 men from the 117th Naval Construction Battalion, the legendary Seabees whose practical engineering skills and mechanical genius were renowned throughout the Pacific. He added specialists from the 5th Marine Tank Battalion and the 81st Ordnance Company. This unique joint service team shared one unified goal: develop a weapon system capable of burning Japanese soldiers out of their caves and bunkers. At the heart of this effort were 2 names that would never make headlines, yet whose innovations would save countless American lives. Machinist mate, First Class A.A. Riker, and Electrician's mate, Second Class Joseph Kissel. Both Seabees, both possessed with first-hand knowledge of previous island campaigns where Marines had died assaulting positions that conventional artillery couldn't touch. They understood the fundamental problem. Firepower wasn't the issue. Applying that firepower against an enemy fighting underground, that was the puzzle. Previous attempts to mount flamethrowers on tanks had produced disappointing results. The Army's early designs were crude, essentially portable flamethrowers bolted onto tank hulls. The Canadian Ronson system, 30 units of which the Marines had acquired, could barely reach 60 to 80 yards with thickened fuel, and fuel capacity limited continuous fire to just 30 or 40 seconds. These weapons were maintenance nightmares that jammed and malfunctioned constantly, with field failure rates exceeding 40%. The first real progress came with the M3 light tank conversions. The so-called Satan tanks, the 43rd Chemical Company's initial creation, Hells Afire, proved the concept could work, but exposed serious limitations. The turret traverse was restricted, the flame gun's elevation was limited. Worse still, the light tank's thin armor made it vulnerable to the Japanese 47mm anti-tank guns that were standard equipment in every defensive position. Unmarked's team needed a better platform. Through military channels reaching to Admiral Nimitz's staff, they obtained 8 M4A3 Sherman medium tanks for conversion. These were proven machines, 35 tons of steel powered by a 500-horsepower Ford engine, armored with plating ranging from 25 to 76 millimeters in thickness. The Sherman had proven its worth in European combat and possessed the protection necessary to survive Japanese anti-tank fire. But locating suitable tanks was just the beginning. The real innovation came when Riker and Kissel made a bold decision: combine the best elements from three existing flamethrower systems. The British Ronson, the Navy Mark I, and captured German designs from North Africa. Working 20-hour days in the sweltering Hawaiian heat, sleeping in shifts beside their welding equipment, the CBs created something entirely new. The resulting system, designated CB-H-1, Construction Battalion Hawaii 1, represented a revolutionary leap in flamethrower technology. Each conversion required 150 pounds of welding rod and 100 electrical connections, every single one critical to the weapon's function. Converting each tank demanded 1,200 man-hours of labor, with 150 parts specially machined by CB metalworkers. The cost per conversion ranged between $20,000 and $25,000, equivalent to roughly $360,000 in modern terms. The technical specifications were nothing short of revolutionary. The CB-H-1 operated at 300 pounds per square inch pressure, triple that of previous designs. Maximum range extended to 150 yards with thickened fuel, nearly 3 times the distance of portable flamethrowers. The specially formulated fuel mixture, developed by the 43rd Chemical Laboratory, combined diesel fuel, gasoline and napalm thickener into a compound that would burn at 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The system could maintain continuous fire for up to 80 seconds, though crews were trained to use short 2 to 3 second bursts to preserve fuel and maintain accuracy. Most importantly, the flamethrower replaced the tank's main gun while allowing full 370-degree turret traverse and elevation adjustments from -10 to +35 degrees. The gunner could aim this new weapon with the precision of a conventional cannon, using the tank's existing periscope and fire control systems. Tank crews needed minimal additional training to operate the new weapon effectively. Perhaps the most ingenious aspect was psychological. The CBs painted the modified tanks in standard Marine Corps olive drab with no special markings, no indication of their terrible purpose. To Japanese observers, they appeared to be ordinary Shermans until the moment they opened fire. By then it was far too late. The fuel system itself was an engineering marvel. The main tanks held 290 gallons of thickened fuel, with an additional 10 gallons of unthickened fuel for ignition. A separate pressure tank contained compressed nitrogen, chosen deliberately over compressed air, because nitrogen wouldn't support combustion if the tank took a direct hit. Multiple safety features throughout the system prevented the catastrophic explosions that had plagued earlier vehicles. Meanwhile, deep beneath Hill 382, General Kuribayashi had calculated his defensive strategy with mathematical precision. His 21,000 men couldn't defeat the Americans. He understood that clearly. His mission was different: make the capture of Iwo Jima so costly that American leadership would reconsider invading the Japanese homeland itself. He'd studied the lessons of Saipan, Peleliu, and the Philippines. Traditional tactics, meeting the enemy at the water's edge, launching massive charges, had proven catastrophically ineffective against American firepower. Kuribayashi made a revolutionary decision that broke with centuries of samurai tradition. There would be no glorious charges, no warriors seeking honorable death in open combat. Instead, his men would fight from underground, transforming Iwo Jima into a subterranean fortress. By February 1945, Japanese engineers had completed 11 miles of interconnected tunnels, with ambitious plans for 17 miles total. The finished sections reached 7 stories deep into the volcanic rock. 5,000 caves and underground chambers had been carved out, many large enough to shelter 300 to 400 men. 1,500 fortified positions dotted the island's surface. Concrete bunkers with 4-foot-thick walls, reinforced with steel rods, salvaged from abandoned construction projects, crowned every strategic height. Each position was carefully sited to provide interlocking fields of fire. Every inch of the island's surface could be swept by Japanese guns, hidden behind steel doors that opened only when firing, then sealed shut against retaliation. The tunnel system was an engineering marvel. Ventilation shafts disguised as natural rock formations provided fresh air. Underground hospitals with operating theaters could handle 400 wounded. Communication centers buried 75 feet below ground coordinated defensive operations through miles of telephone wire. Storage chambers held enough rice, water, and ammunition for a 2-month siege. Kuribayashi positioned his forces with mathematical precision. The southern sector around Mount Suribachi was designated a semi-independent command with 2,000 men manning artillery positions that could rake the landing beaches. The northern plateau, where terrain favored defense, held the bulk of Japanese forces, 15,000 men under Kuribayashi's direct control. Between these strongholds, a central reserve of 4,000 troops could reinforce any threatened sector through the tunnel network. The Americans knew Iwo Jima would be difficult. Intelligence reports suggested well-prepared defenses, but aerial reconnaissance couldn't penetrate the underground network. 74 consecutive days of bombing had dropped 6,800 tons of explosives on the island. Naval bombardment had hurled 22,000 shells onto Japanese positions. American planners expected these preparations to have eliminated most resistance, projecting the island would fall in 5 days. They were catastrophically wrong. The preliminary bombardment had destroyed fewer than 200 of the 1,545 positions. The tunnel system remained virtually intact. Most Japanese soldiers hadn't even been scratched. Japanese defensive doctrine had evolved significantly since earlier Pacific battles. Intelligence from Saipan and Peleliu emphasized the vulnerability of flamethrower operators. The weapon's signature, black smoke from burning diesel fuel, made operators easy to spot. Limited range forced operators to expose themselves to enemy fire. In previous battles, portable flamethrower casualties had exceeded 70%, with some units losing 92% of their flame operators. Specially trained machine gunners concentrated fire on soldiers carrying portable flamethrowers. Snipers received extra ammunition specifically for targeting flame operators. Infantry units practiced rushing flamethrower positions with bayonets, exploiting the weapon's minimum range where the operator couldn't depress the nozzle enough for self-defense. But all Japanese planning assumed flamethrowers would be carried by infantry. The concept of armored flamethrowers, tanks that could approach fortified positions under their own armor while delivering accurate incendiary attacks at unprecedented range, had never been considered. Japanese defensive positions, carefully designed to withstand artillery and aerial bombardment, had no special provisions against burning petroleum that could seep through apertures and ventilation shafts. This oversight would prove catastrophic. The fortifications that represented Japan's greatest strength would become death traps when confronted with weapons that transformed solid defenses into crematoriums. On February 19th, D-Day, the 8 M4A3 flamethrower tanks landed on Iwo Jima's beaches, mixed among the regular Shermans of the 4th and 5th Tank Battalions. The official Marine designation was M4A3R5, though various documents used different nomenclature, including POA, CWS H1, and CBMK1. By the following morning, these 8 machines would fundamentally alter the mathematics of death on this volcanic island. The assault forces landed in the 5th wave at about 100 hours after the beaches had been secured enough to permit operations. The Navy had given explicit orders that these troops would be held in reserve during the opening phase. Marine leadership needed time to read the tactical situation before deploying these specialized and irreplaceable units. 8 tanks arrived with careful precision. 4 would reinforce the 4th Marine Division, 4 would strengthen the 5th. Each vehicle bore an identification number running from 431 to 438. Crews who wanted to personalize their machines had done so, painting names like Hellfire across the steel or decorating them with blaze of glory. Others chose to keep their vehicles unmarked, letting their devastating purpose remain silent until the moment they would be needed. Through that first full day, the flame-throwing tanks remained stationary near the shore while dozens of Marines fell, then hundreds more, straining against Japanese positions that seemed to have no physical form. The volcanic soil itself fought against the landing force. With each step through ash that reached nearly to the knee, movement drained energy. The old methods of warfare were collapsing under Japanese fire. The Navy guns roared offshore, but their shells couldn't smash through bunkers buried deep beneath volcanic stone and reinforced concrete. Artillery rounds thundered across the landscape, only to bounce away from fortifications designed to withstand the heaviest naval bombardment imaginable. Marine infantry found themselves charging against positions that might as well have been mountains carved from solid rock. The first day's toll was devastating, more than 2,400 Marines killed or wounded. The beach transformed into a shooting gallery. Japanese guns that had waited in silence suddenly opened up, targeting the packed masses of landing forces struggling to get off the sand. Sherman tanks trying to push forward sank into the ash or were torn open by anti-tank fire emerging from positions no one had seen. By darkness, the invasion force had moved less than 700 yards from the waterline, nowhere near the objectives that day. Marine planners had hoped to take the first airfield by now. February the 20th dawned with the tactical situation growing dire. The 21st Marine Regiment was stuck, pinned down on the approaches to Motoyama Airfield No. 1. 3 fortified concrete structures commanded the area ahead. Machine gun fire from these positions wove together in overlapping patterns, creating a 200-yard-wide zone where nothing could survive. 2 companies of riflemen had already suffered catastrophic losses trying direct assaults. The regiment had lost more than a third of its strength in under 2 days. Lieutenant Colonel William Duplantes, running the 3rd Battalion of the 21st Marines, made a decision that would shift the entire battle. He requested the flamethrower tanks. At 14:20 hours, the first M4A3R3 flamethrower tank rolled into battle. Tank 431 was under the command of Staff Sergeant Robert Metzger, someone who had survived combat on Saipan and Tinian. He maneuvered the tank from an angle, using wrecked Japanese aircraft for concealment. To anyone watching from the Japanese positions, it appeared to be just another Sherman tank attempting the same assault that had already failed so many times. Metzger moved deliberately, aware that the element of surprise represented their sole advantage. Inside the tank, 5 men prepared for what was coming. Private First Class James Morrison gripped the controls, steering the 35-ton vehicle through volcanic ash that threatened to bury it. Private Robert Chen positioned himself at the bow machine gun, scanning for Japanese infantry. Corporal Anthony Vitelli monitored the fuel pressure, watching the gauge needle hover at 300 psi, exactly what they needed for maximum effective range. Gunner Corporal Thomas Carson tracked the nearest pillbox through his scope, keeping it centered as they advanced. At 125 yards from the nearest fortification, Metzger spoke. Gunner, flamethrower, pillbox, fire. The CBH-1 burst to life with a sound witnesses would later describe as something beyond human experience, the roar of a blowtorch from some infernal place. Pressurized nitrogen propelled a stream of thickened fuel oil through the air. The burning liquid crashed directly into the pillbox's opening, a stream of fire that flowed into that concrete tomb like molten rock. The consequences came in an instant, and with horrible finality. Inside, temperatures climbed past 1,200 degrees in seconds. The air itself was consumed so rapidly that Japanese soldiers began suffocating before the flames even reached them. Those few who managed to survive the initial heat surge scrambled toward rear exits, only to run into Marine rifle fire. The infantry had learned to position themselves for exactly this possibility. Metzger swung the turret 30 degrees and aimed at the second pillbox. This time, the occupants were prepared. A Japanese 47mm anti-tank gun roared to life. Shells struck the Sherman's front armor and careened upward. The tank shuddered from impact but kept moving forward. Gunner Carson squeezed off another burst, maintaining fire for 15 seconds until black smoke poured from every opening in that fortification. The third pillbox required a different approach. Its location behind a rocky slope made straightforward engagement impossible. Metzger told Morrison to push in closer, within 80 yards of where Japanese soldiers were dug in. As the tank rose over a small ridge, Japanese soldiers erupted from spider holes, sprinting toward the vehicle with satchel charges and anti-tank mines in their hands. Chen's machine gun opened up from the bow, but several Japanese soldiers managed to reach the tank's vulnerable rear. That's when the CBH-1's special design proved its worth. Unlike standard flamethrower tanks that could only point their weapons forward, this version allowed Gunner Carson to swing the turret completely around, 180 degrees, and unleash fire directly behind the tank. The attacking soldiers vanished into a wall of flame that observers described as appearing like hell itself had split open. With the third fortification dealt with, Marines from the 21st Regiment pushed forward 400 yards in 2 hours. That represented more progress than they'd managed during the previous 48 hours. Word traveled fast through the Marine communications network. The flamethrower tanks actually worked, and crucially, they survived where ordinary tanks got destroyed. By late afternoon, all 8 flamethrower tanks were engaged across the front. The change was immediate and profound. Tank 434, supporting the 23rd Marines near the eastern boat landing, destroyed 4 separate fortified positions in a single day. Tank crews began perfecting a maneuver called corkscrew and burn, spiraling their approach to dodge anti-tank fire while maintaining continuous flamethrower suppression. The fear factor proved as devastating as the physical destruction. Japanese soldiers trained to hold their positions until death began abandoning their posts when flame tanks appeared on the horizon. They chose flight over incineration. Tank 437 worked alongside the 24th Marines, developing breach and clear operations. The flamethrower would suppress a position's defenders. Then Marine engineers would surge forward with demolition charges to destroy the fortification permanently. That combination proved incredibly effective against strongpoints that had resisted days of conventional assault. In a single afternoon, one flame tank and engineer team destroyed 7 bunkers that had previously halted an entire battalion's advance. But Tank 432 showed the weapon's true psychological reach. Supporting the 26th Marines below Mount Suribachi, the tank approached a cluster of interconnected caves. Sergeant William Patterson ordered his driver to stop 100 yards from the cave mouths. Patterson peered through the tank's periscope and saw Japanese soldiers watching from within the darkness. He triggered a brief burst of flame into the air, nothing more than a demonstration of what was possible. The psychological impact was instantaneous and unprecedented. Japanese soldiers began streaming out of rear exits, abandoning positions they'd been ordered to defend to the last man. Marine riflemen stood stunned, initially failing even to fire on the retreating enemy. In just 30 minutes, an entire defensive sector collapsed without the tank firing a single shot at any actual positions. This represented something never before seen in Japanese military history: a mass abandonment of defensive positions. By the time darkness fell on February the 20th, Marine units were already restructuring their tactical plans around flame tank deployment. Offensive operations were being delayed until flame tanks could be positioned ahead. Infantry learned to stay about 50 yards behind the tanks, close enough to capitalize on the shock effect, but far enough to escape the heat blast that could singe eyebrows from 30 yards away. Artillery spotters began calling down fire specifically for flame tank follow-up rather than conventional bombardment. The statistics from that first day of flame tank combat were striking. 47 fortified positions destroyed. Casualties in supported areas down 40% from the day before. 600 yards of ground gained in areas that hadn't moved in 48 hours. Perhaps most important was the psychological dimension. For the first time, considerable numbers of Japanese soldiers were choosing to leave their posts rather than die defending them. General Kurabayashi's response came that night with emergency orders. The flame tanks became priority targets. Every 47mm anti-tank gun that could be relocated was assigned to concentrate fire on these vehicles. Special assault teams were assembled, volunteers willing to charge forward with explosive packs strapped to their bodies. Infantry were instructed to aim concentrated rifle fire at the flame tank's vision ports, attempting to blind the crews, but the fundamental problem remained unsolvable. The flame tanks looked identical to regular Shermans until the moment they opened fire. Japanese gunners couldn't identify priority targets until too late. Focusing on flame tanks also meant neglecting conventional tanks providing supporting fire. Mechanical innovation had given the Americans tactical surprise. On February 23rd, the same day Marines planted the flag on Mount Suribachi, the flame tanks faced their greatest challenge. The 3rd Marine Division was attacking Hill 382, the second highest point on the entire island, and critical to Kurabayashi's defensive network to the north. The hill was riddled with bunkers and tunnel systems reaching down 7 stories into the ground. Japanese defenders had zeroed in every approach with artillery and mortars. Japanese engineers had built the position to be virtually unbeatable. Multiple layers of defense with interlocking fields of fire underground passages, letting defenders appear behind attacking forces. Previous attempts had failed with casualty rates exceeding 50%. The 1st Battalion of the 9th Marines had lost 7 out of every 10 men just trying to reach the hill's approaches. At 0800 hours, 4 flame tanks advanced in formation, backed by 6 conventional Shermans and a full battalion of Marines. The Japanese were prepared this time. They had positioned 75mm mountain guns, larger than standard 47mm anti-tank weapons, specifically to target flame tanks. As the lead flame tank went over the first crest, concentrated fire erupted from 3 hidden positions. The first round hit Tank 433's track and stopped it cold. The crew kept shooting flame while stationary, creating a firewall that covered the other tanks and suppressed Japanese gun positions. This sacrifice allowed the remaining tanks to advance. Tank 431 pushed through the smoke while artillery shells whistled overhead. Later, driver Private First Class Morrison described navigating through smoke so thick his periscope gave him barely 10 feet of visibility. He moved forward by instruments and instinct. At 60 yards from the main Japanese bunker complex, Tank 434's flamethrower ignited. But the Japanese had learned something new. Engineers had installed steel plates that could seal bunker openings between machine gun bursts. The flames hit the steel harmlessly and dissipated. It seemed the Japanese had discovered a defense against flame tanks. Gunner Corporal Michael Rodriguez noticed something critical. Those steel plates were glowing cherry red after sustained flame contact. Metal at that temperature would warp and buckle. Rodriguez kept his finger on the trigger for 45 seconds, dangerously long, nearly depleting the fuel reserves. The steel gave way. The burning fuel poured through the gaps and into the concrete chamber. Temperatures inside became unbearable. Ammunition stored inside began detonating in a cascade of explosions. Concrete fractured from the thermal shock. Secondary blasts exposed tunnel entrances the Japanese had so carefully concealed. Marines rushed forward with satchel charges, throwing explosives into every opening they could find before defenders could reorganize. Hill 382's outer defenses crumbled. The position considered impregnable was falling, but the day also showed the flame tank's limitations. Tank 431 ran through its fuel supply after 80 seconds of continuous operation. Refueling meant retreating to support areas where fuel trucks waited, a process requiring at least 2 hours. During that window, Japanese defenders could rebuild and resupply their positions. The tanks were powerful, but not unlimited. That same day, Corporal Herschel Woody Williams showed that individual flamethrowers still had their place. When flame tanks couldn't navigate a narrow ravine called the amphitheater, Williams moved forward alone, carrying a 70-pound M22 flamethrower. Over 4 hours of fighting, protected only by 4 riflemen, 2 of whom gave their lives covering him, Williams single-handedly destroyed 7 pillboxes that tanks couldn't reach. Williams's approach worked beautifully with the flame tanks. When armor couldn't reach certain positions, soldiers equipped with portable flamethrowers could push forward where vehicles couldn't go. That single day of fighting would define his entire legacy and ultimately lead to the nation's highest military honor. He would live longer than any other World War II Medal of Honor recipient, but eventually passed away in June of 2022 at 98 years old. His citation described how he stepped forward without hesitation when tanks were struggling to cut through the fortified landscape of concrete bunkers, buried explosives, and black volcanic terrain. Corporal Williams advanced alone into devastating machine gun fire, attempting to neutralize positions that seemed impenetrable to everyone else. The numbers from that opening week painted a striking picture. In areas where flamethrower tanks provided support, Marine casualties dropped dramatically, roughly 40% lower than attacks without this new weapon. Japanese strongholds that had withstood days of regular assault crumbled within hours when the flame tanks arrived. 8 tanks consumed an enormous 70,000 gallons of fuel mixture during those 7 days, destroying approximately 345 fortified positions. Every day, they burned through about 10,000 gallons, which meant establishing fuel supply stations directly behind the lines. When March arrived and fighting shifted to Iwo Jima's northern plateau, the landscape transformed into something altogether nightmarish. Sulfur vents, jagged canyons, and volcanic rock fields that made traditional tank movement nearly impossible. General Kuribayashi had deliberately chosen this terrain for his final defensive position, because the broken ground favored those digging in rather than those attacking. The Marines nicknamed it the meat grinder, after losing 850 men just capturing a single hilltop. Tanks that tried navigating this shattered ground suffered terrible damage. Sharp volcanic rocks shredded tracks into pieces. Hidden obstacles waiting beneath thick ash layers flipped vehicles over or left them stranded. The crews adapted once more. Without space to maneuver freely, the tanks transformed into mobile fortifications, positioning themselves at strategic locations to support the infantry pushing forward. Marine engineers from the 5th Engineer Battalion worked through entire nights constructing ramps and cutting pathways, frequently under sniper fire, creating routes that allowed these tanks to reach spots everyone thought impossible. When direct assault became impractical, something remarkable happened. Gunners learned to fire the flame streams at rocks and canyon walls, bouncing the flames around corners and into hidden positions beyond direct sight. On March 8th, exactly 17 days into the battle, Tank number 436 pulled off what crews later called the impossible maneuver. Supporting the 9th Marines as they assaulted Cushman's Pocket, a system of caves and bunkers carved into an almost vertical cliff face, the tank commander Sergeant Daniel Foster made a dangerous calculation. If he angled the flamethrower at maximum elevation, the burning stream might arc over the cliff edge and rain down into Japanese positions from directly above. The physics were barely workable. The CBH-1 flamethrower maxed out at 35 degrees of elevation, but hitting the target required 40 degrees. Foster made the decision to position his tank on rubble that naval bombardment had created, tilting the entire machine backward at a precarious angle. With the tank balanced dangerously and enemy mortar fire exploding nearby, Gunner Corporal Anthony Vitelli squeezed the trigger. The burning napalm shot high into the sky, seeming to pause at the peak of its arc before plunging down into the Japanese positions below. What happened next shook Japanese morale to its core. Defenders had absolutely believed their elevated strongholds were immune to flamethrower attacks. That conviction vanished in an instant. People reported watching Japanese soldiers leap from the cliffs, choosing to die falling rather than die in the inferno. By mid-March, these flamethrower tanks had evolved into something revolutionary, the central component of an integrated combat system. Each tank operated with dedicated support personnel. Regular tanks suppressed anti-tank guns, riflemen protected against suicide attackers, engineers cleared obstacles, and ammunition teams hauled the 300-gallon fuel trailers that extended how long tanks could operate. This coordination represented a dramatic shift in how assaults could be executed, with effects that would shape Marine Corps tactics for generations. Managing the fuel supply alone became extraordinarily complicated. Electrician's mate, second-class Kissel, one of the original designers, had traveled to Iwo Jima specifically to oversee maintenance operations. He later documented how keeping 8 tanks running depended on a supply network stretching all the way back to Pearl Harbor. Fuel mixing stations ran continuously, combining diesel, gasoline, and napalm powder in extremely precise proportions. The mixture became unusable after 72 hours, when it would separate and clog the flame guns. Japanese commanders continued adjusting their response. They assembled specialized anti-tank squads, volunteers who would charge carrying explosives strapped to their bodies. These suicide attacks sometimes succeeded. On March 11th, tank number 438 was destroyed when a Japanese soldier detonated himself directly against the engine compartment, killing 3 of the 5 crew members. Yet these victories came at terrible human cost. Replacement tanks arrived from the beach constantly, and damaged vehicles frequently got repaired and returned to combat. From his underground command post deep beneath the northern plateau, General Kuribayashi understood what this weapon meant strategically. In his final message to Tokyo, transmitted March 17th, He wrote that the American flame tanks had proven more devastating than all artillery and air attacks combined. They accomplished in minutes what conventional weapons required days to achieve. He stated plainly that no effective defense existed against this technology, and that American forces possessed not just greater numbers, but greater creativity. The climax arrived during the final week of March as Marines pushed into the gorge, Kuribayashi's absolute last stronghold. This twisted landscape of ravines and caves, which Marines called the Bloody Gorge, represented the ultimate confrontation between American tactical innovation and Japanese fighting determination. In an area barely exceeding 700 yards square, around 3,000 remaining Japanese defenders prepared for their final stand. On March 21st, 30 days into the operation, every operational flamethrower attack made ready, 6 of the original 8 with 2 under repair, for a coordinated assault. 4 additional flame tanks had rushed from Hawaii to reinforce them, though these newer models used the less powerful Ronson system with a maximum range of 60 to 80 yards. This would represent the largest concentration of flame weapons ever deployed in Pacific War operations. Tank number 431, repaired after being disabled on Hill 382, spearheaded the advance. Its armor displayed every wound from battle, welded patches where shell fragments had penetrated, dents from dozens of hits that hadn't broken through, scorching from nearby explosions. Number 433, with a makeshift track repair that created a distinctive clanking sound, took the left side. Numbers 434, 436, and 437 formed the center, while 432 anchored the right flank. The assault commenced at 10 in the morning, with tanks advancing in crescent formation, their overlapping flame fields eliminating any space where Japanese defenders could hide. Marine infantry advanced behind them, throwing white phosphorus grenades into cave openings to mark targets. Engineers moved in afterward, with demolition charges to seal positions that the flamethrowers had cleared. Japanese resistance remained fanatical, but increasingly powerless. Suicide squads burst from hidden positions only to be incinerated before approaching the tanks. Anti-tank guns fired from point-blank range, crews maintaining fire even as flames consumed their positions. During one remarkable moment, a Japanese officer emerged from a bunker wielding a samurai sword, charging straight at tank number 434. The bowgunner held fire, perhaps stunned or perhaps showing respect, allowing Marine riflemen to kill the officer just before he reached the vehicle. His sword was later sent to Marine Corps headquarters as a testimony to the enemy's desperate bravery. By nightfall on March 21st, the gorge position had collapsed. More than 800 Japanese defenders lay dead, many burned beyond recognition. The flamethrower tanks had burned through 8,000 gallons of fuel mixture in that single day, shattering all campaign records. Marine casualties, numbering 92 killed and 257 wounded, remained substantial, but represented only a fraction of what ordinary assault tactics would have demanded. Yet both sides were beginning to comprehend the cost of this innovation. Tank crews reported severe psychological damage from their participation in this destruction. Corporal Carlson from Tank 431 later described hearing them screaming when the flames hit, not for very long, but hearing it. He admitted that sometimes at night the sound still returned to him. The smell was worse, burning human flesh mixed with sulfur from the volcanic rock. Maintenance personnel discovered human remains stuck fast to tank tracks, requiring blowtorches to remove them. The machines themselves were deteriorating rapidly under relentless combat stress. Transmissions failed from operating in volcanic ash. Fuel lines became clogged with carbon buildup from the napalm mixture. Track pins sheared from the weight of additional armor plates that crews had welded on for protection. By late March, maintaining just 4 operational tanks required cannibalizing parts from damaged vehicles. On March 26, 1945, Iwo Jima received the official secured designation. The campaign had stretched to 36 days instead of the predicted 5. American casualties totaled between 26,000 and 38,000, with 6,821 killed. Numbers that stunned the American public and military leadership. Japanese losses approached totality. Of roughly 21,000 defenders, only 216 survived as prisoners. The remainder died fighting, or increasingly as the battle wore on, by taking their own lives rather than face capture or death by flame. The flamethrower attacks had fundamentally altered how this battle unfolded. Post-battle analysis concluded they had probably reduced American casualties by around 5,000 servicemen. They had demolished more than 1,000 fortified positions, consumed 360,000 gallons of fuel mixture, and permanently restructured how Marines conducted assaults. Perhaps more significantly, they had shattered the widely held belief that Japanese forces were unbeatable in defensive terrain. Captain Frank Caldwell, commanding Company F of the 26th Marines, offered perhaps the clearest assessment. He stated the flame tank, more than anything else, won this battle. Artillery, naval gunfire, and airstrikes couldn't force Japanese soldiers from their underground fortresses. Only the flamethrower attacks achieved what nothing else could accomplish. Statistical breakdown revealed the actual scope. Roughly 30% of all Japanese casualties on Iwo Jima came from flame weapons, both tank-mounted and portable versions. Where flame tanks provided support, advance rates increased by 300% compared to unsupported attacks. Japanese prisoners, extraordinarily rare in Pacific battles, totaled 216, surpassing the combined total from Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu. Many specifically mentioned terror of burning alive as the reason they surrendered. The implications stretched well beyond Iwo Jima. The Marine Corps immediately ordered 54 additional flamethrower tanks for upcoming operations. Colonel Unmacht's team at Schofield Barracks accelerated production into overdrive. Working with AQD or A priority, the same classification given the B-29 bomber and Manhattan project, they designed the improved CBH-2 model with greater range and better reliability. By June 1945, 70 fresh flame tanks were prepared for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. The Army, watching Marine successes on Iwo Jima, expedited its own flamethrower tank program. The entire 713th Tank Battalion converted to flame tanks for the Okinawa campaign. Throughout the April to June 1945 Battle of Okinawa, Army flame tanks would burn through 200,000 gallons of fuel mixture, proving equally effective against Japanese cave systems in the island's southern region. The weapon that began as a rushed improvisation became standard equipment throughout Pacific operations. But the strategic impact extended beyond battlefield tactics. Japanese military doctrine, refined across centuries, had failed dramatically when facing American technological creativity. Flamethrower attacks represented more than simply a new weapon. They reflected how warfare had transformed from individual bravery into industrial capacity. Production figures demonstrated this reality. Colonel Unmacht's flame tank group ultimately built 354 flame tanks before the war ended. The chemical plant at Schofield Barracks manufactured 226,343 gallons of fuel. The napalm production facility they constructed could generate 1,000 gallons daily. This industrial system, replicated across the Pacific, enabled American forces to literally burn through Japanese defensive systems. The civilians who developed these weapons received little public attention. Machinist mate and electrician's mate Kissel returned to civilian employment after the war. Their names largely disappeared except in dusty technical documents. Colonel Unmacht continued developing chemical weapons until his retirement, his role in the victory known only to military historians. Yet their creativity had preserved thousands of American lives and shortened one of the Pacific War's most devastating campaigns. The tank crews faced different struggles. Many developed what would later become recognized as post-traumatic stress. Memories of people reduced to ash, screams cut short by consuming fire, haunted men who had performed what their duty demanded. Sergeant Metzger kept silent about his experiences until approaching the end of his life in 1993, telling his grandson that they had done what necessity required. He stressed that nobody should feel pride in incinerating human beings, but those tanks had preserved many Marine lives. That represented what he chose to remember. After the war, flame tank veterans established an informal network. They gathered annually in Hawaii, returning to Schofield Barracks, where these weapons had originated. These unreported reunions permitted men to discuss experiences too terrible for civilians to comprehend. The final gathering occurred in 2010, drawing only 4 surviving crew members. Japanese accounts emerged gradually through prisoner interviews and captured records. Soldiers educated to believe death in combat guaranteed spiritual reward found themselves paralyzed by burning's terror. Fleeing a combat position seemed less dishonorable than dying in underground infernos. This psychological breakthrough led to the first widespread surrender in Japanese military history. Lieutenant Yamada stood among the survivors, one of just 216 men who had endured the inferno of February 20th. In the years that followed, he would recount his experience to American intelligence officers, his words carrying the weight of men unprepared for the particular horror they had faced. "We had trained for every conceivable form of death," he explained. "Rifle fire, artillery barrages, bayonet charges, the slow agony of starvation. But nothing had prepared us for burning liquid that hunted us through our deepest shelters. Those flame tanks shattered something in us that conventional weapons never could. The underground fortifications that had been Japan's greatest strategic advantage became death traps instead." Former Sergeant Masao Hayashi, whose own body bore the marks of his escape attempt, described the devastation with brutal honesty. "The napalm came like a deluge," he recalled. "It flooded into every crevice, every chamber, every corner we thought might protect us." Men scrambled toward emergency exits, only to find more flames waiting on the other side. Some chose to end their own lives rather than burn. Others ran straight into American gunfire, deciding that bullets were preferable to being consumed alive. Hayashi spoke of warriors hardened by years of combat in China, men who had learned to face death with discipline and honor. Yet these soldiers refused to move into positions once they saw flame tanks approaching. This was a death nobody had trained for. The very concept of dying this way violated everything they understood about warfare. The impact of these weapons rippled far beyond Iwo Jima. American military strategists recognized immediately what had been demonstrated on that volcanic island. The Marine Corps fundamentally reimagined how it would wage war, building its assault doctrine around combined arms tactics that wove together armor, infantry, and engineering units in coordinated operations. The idea that specialized vehicles could be engineered to solve specific battlefield challenges became embedded in military thinking. Future weapons development would chase adaptability and creative innovation rather than simply increasing raw firepower. The technology continued its evolution. When American forces faced Chinese bunker complexes during the Korean War, the same M4A3R3 Sherman flamethrowers proved devastatingly effective. The battles around Punch Bowl and Heartbreak Ridge saw Marine flame tanks obliterate over 300 enemy positions, though with somewhat less dramatic results because Chinese commanders had studied the weapon's capabilities and adjusted their tactics accordingly. Not until 1978 did the military finally retire the last flamethrower tank, an M132 variant built on an M113 armored personnel carrier. That retirement marked the end of a weapons lineage stretching back to 8 hastily converted Shermans prepared in a secret warehouse in Hawaii. By then, thermobaric explosives and precision-guided missiles had assumed the role that flamethrowers once held as the preferred method for destroying fortified positions. International law moved to restrict these weapons. Protocol 3 of the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons eventually limited how incendiary weapons could be deployed. The very instrument that had proved decisive at Iwo Jima gradually became viewed as excessively brutal as public attitudes shifted. Yet military historians often note the irony at the heart of this history. For all their horror, the flamethrower tanks had compressed the battle's timeline and almost certainly prevented the far greater casualties that conventional assault methods would have demanded. The industrial dimension of this story cannot be overstated. American factories produced nearly 50,000 Sherman tanks during the war. Just 354 of them were converted into flamethrower configuration. Yet these few hundred vehicles delivered impact wildly disproportionate to their numbers. 8 tanks had redirected the course of a battle that might have consumed months and extracted tens of thousands more casualties. The conversion cost, Roughly $200,000 per tank in 1945 money seemed negligible against the lives preserved. Military analysts crunched the numbers carefully. They estimated that each flame tank at Iwo Jima had potentially prevented around 625 American casualties when you compared casualty rates between supported and unsupported attacks. In the grim calculus of warfare, the investment in innovation had paid extraordinary dividends in blood not spilled. Beyond the mathematics, though, lay something more profound, a psychological transformation. These weapons had proven that technological cleverness could overcome even the most determined human resistance. The era when individual warrior skill could decide battles was passing. Victory now belonged to industrial powers capable of superior production and technical advancement. The samurai code, however noble its ideals, could not withstand petroleum delivered by mass-manufactured machines. In Iwo Jima's volcanic soil lay the remains of over 20,000 Japanese defenders who had died holding positions they believed impregnable. Many had been incinerated by a weapon they could never have imagined. Their deaths symbolized not merely a battle's conclusion, but the sunset of an age when spiritual commitment could overcome material disadvantage. The 8 M4A3R3 tanks that fought there were simply machines, steel, aluminum, rubber, and mechanical parts assembled by workers who would never experience combat. Yet they embodied something grander. They represented American industrial mobilization, scientific ingenuity, and mechanical capability directed toward victory. The construction workers who built them, the Marines who operated them, and the Japanese soldiers who died facing them all participated in a revolution that would reshape modern combat. Today, one surviving flamethrower tank from that battle rests in the National Museum of the Marine Corps in Quantico, Virginia. Tank 434 displays the scars of its service, welding patches where armor had been replaced, dents from shell strikes, scratches from volcanic rock. A small plaque describes its specifications and combat history. Yet no museum display can truly capture the compressed nitrogen roaring, the acrid reek of napalm mixed with sulfur, the sight of liquid fire cascading like water into underground bunkers. Visitors often move past quickly, disturbed by the weapon's terrifying purpose. School groups question why anyone would develop such a horrific device. Veterans who understand the full context tend to pause longer, some rendering salutes, others simply standing in quiet reflection. For these men, the tank represents not war's glorification, but acknowledgement of war's unbearable necessities. The last reunion of Iwo Jima flame tank veterans occurred in 2015, marking the 70th anniversary of the battle. Only 3 crew members made the journey, all well into their 90s. They gathered at the museum to exchange memories with historians working to preserve their first-hand accounts. Corporal Anthony Vitelli, who had served as a gunner on one of the tanks, offered perhaps the most touching reflection. "When people ask whether I'm proud of what we did," he said, "pride isn't quite the word. We performed a terrible job that nonetheless needed doing. Those tanks protected Marine lives. That's what matters." The designers, builders, and operators of these machines have nearly all departed now. Corporal Herschel Woody Williams, who had fought beside the flame tanks with his portable flamethrower, became the final Medal of Honor recipient from Iwo Jima to pass away, dying in June 2022 at age 98. With his death came the loss of the last living witness to flame warfare's terrifying reality. His foundation continues its work honoring Gold Star families, ensuring that the sacrifices made will not fade from memory. Colonel Unmacht's classified reports, declassified in the 1970s, revealed the frenetic pace of innovation that created these tanks. The construction battalions had pushed themselves to the absolute limit, working 20-hour days and sleeping in shifts beside their welding equipment, accomplishing in weeks what standard military procurement would have required years to complete. Their reward was witnessing their creation exceed every expectation, compressing one of the Pacific War's bloodiest battles into a shorter time frame. When Japanese military archives opened to researchers decades later, the perspective from the defending side painted a clear picture. Report after report described the paralysis of watching liquid fire advance, the knowledge that concrete and steel offered no refuge. Orders to defend positions to the death became hollow when death arrived as flowing fire that penetrated every hiding place. One Japanese report documented the tactical desperation plainly. The flame tanks rendered our every defensive advantage meaningless. Our elevation meant nothing when fire could arc over obstacles. Our tunnel depth meant nothing when flames flowed like water through our passageways. Our concrete and steel could withstand tons of explosives, but offered nothing against liquid fire. General Kuribayashi transmitted his final message just before his death in late March 1945. His words contained a striking prophecy about the future of warfare. "The Americans have not defeated us simply through superior numbers or firepower," he observed. "They have defeated us through superior imagination, transforming our greatest strength, our underground fortifications, into instruments of our own destruction. The wars that follow will belong to nations that can imagine entirely new forms of combat, not to those who merely perfect the old ways." History would prove his foresight accurate. The military revolution, beginning with 8 flame tanks at Iwo Jima, would continue through guided missiles, precision weapons, and eventually cyber capabilities. The principle remained constant throughout. Technological creativity defeats established tactics. Imagination triumphs over convention. The shift from conventional to flame warfare occurred almost overnight. Yet it altered combat doctrine permanently. Marines trained for traditional assaults had to learn rapidly how to coordinate with flame tanks, using their shock effect to shatter defensive lines thought unbreakable. This integration happened not through formal military training programs, but through improvisation under fire, the kind of adaptation that has long characterized American military flexibility. Post-war statistical analysis revealed striking patterns in how the weapon affected combat outcomes. In sectors where flame tanks operated, Japanese defenders abandoned their positions 70% more frequently before being overrun. The psychological impact exceeded the physical destruction many times over. Sometimes the mere presence of flame tanks in an area caused defensive collapse without a single shot being fired. One Marine intelligence report captured the scale of the psychological effect. "Enemy fear of these tanks approaches panic," the officers noted. Prisoners consistently report that soldiers refuse orders to occupy positions once flame tanks have been spotted in the area. In 36 days of combat, those 8 flamethrower tanks had accomplished something remarkable. They had validated an entirely new form of warfare, rescued thousands of American Marines from becoming casualties, and contributed substantially to victory in one of World War II's most critical battles. Their legacy would echo through every subsequent conflict where American forces encountered entrenched opponents, from Korea to Vietnam to Iraq. Yet the moral questions remained unresolved and complex. Tank crews who survived often wrestled with what they had accomplished. The industrial efficiency of death by incineration, the mass production scale of human destruction, challenged traditional notions of honorable combat. These men had become instruments of terrible necessity, wielding weapons that reduced human beings to ash in mere seconds. Many never discussed their service afterward, carrying their memories in silence rather than imposing that burden on others. The war had demanded things of them that their pre-war selves could not have imagined. A 1985 reconciliation ceremony on Iwo Jima provided a final testimony of sorts. Former tank commander Robert Metzger and former Lieutenant Kiyoshi Yamada, who had witnessed the first flame tank assault 4 decades earlier, stood together on the ground where Tank 431 had made its initial strike. Through an interpreter, Yamada spoke first. "I carried hatred toward you for 40 years, he said. "These flame tanks killed my companions in ways I cannot forget. But I understand now that war transforms all of us into something we never intended to become. You did what circumstances demanded, as did we." Metzger's response was simple and direct. "We were just boys trying to stay alive. I'm grateful we both survived to stand here today." The 2 elderly men embraced. As the sun descended toward the horizon, they walked together toward the memorial, honoring all who had perished. Behind them, Mount Suribachi rose against the darkening sky. The island that had once blazed with combat fury had found its way back to peace. The flamethrower tank era had begun and concluded in the Pacific. Its legacy burned across volcanic terrain in the pages of military history. 8 modified Shermans had fundamentally altered the nature of warfare, proving that victory in modern conflict required industrial power married to battlefield innovation. The flames themselves had long since extinguished, yet their mark on military history would burn indefinitely. The Battle of Iwo Jima had been won not through courage alone, though both sides had displayed exceptional bravery, but through the combination of American industrial might and battlefield creativity. The flamethrower tanks represented the convergence of technology, tactical thinking, and determination that would underpin American military dominance for generations. They were weapons of their historical moment, terrible necessities in a war demanding total victory. The Japanese defenders had fought with unmatched courage, adhering to orders to resist unto death. They had constructed the Pacific War's most formidable defensive position, a subterranean fortress that traditional weapons could never have penetrated. But they had not foreseen weapons that poured like liquid fire, seeking out every cavern and tunnel, converting their underground sanctuary into an inferno. Their defeat stemmed not from insufficient courage, but from an encounter with superior technology and innovation. The numbers tell the closing chapter with unflinching clarity. 8 flamethrower tanks, 360,000 gallons of fuel mixture, over 1,045 enemy positions destroyed, approximately 5,000 American casualties prevented, over 6,000 Japanese soldiers killed by flame weapons, 36 days of combat that would have stretched into months without the flame tanks. Modern warfare's mathematics were simple. Technological advantage translated directly into preserved lives and won battles. The volcanic island of Iwo Jima, returned to Japan and renamed Iwo To, bears few visible reminders of the fighting that once consumed its landscape. Nature has reclaimed the terrain, spreading vegetation across old shell craters, filling trenches with volcanic earth. Beneath the surface, though, sealed caverns and collapsed tunnels still contain the remains of soldiers who perished in the flames. Their sacrifice lives on in the memories of increasingly scarce witnesses. General Holland Smith, who commanded the 5th Amphibious Corps at Iwo Jima, offered perhaps the definitive judgment in his memoir. The flamethrower tanks represented the dividing line between triumph and catastrophe. Without them, we would have paid an impossibly high cost for every meter of that terrible island. They constituted horrible weapons, undeniably. But warfare is a horrible enterprise. In the final accounting, they preserved more lives than any other weapon we possessed. The flames that destroyed Japanese positions have long since cooled. The men who operated them have mostly passed from living memory. Yet the revolution they sparked, the shift from individual warrior prowess to technological dominance, continues shaping military doctrine across the globe. In 8 modified Sherman tanks, America had discovered the weapon that would break the deadlock of the Pacific War's most formidable fortress, forever transforming warfare in the process. The battle concluded, the war would follow shortly after, but the echo remains eternal, the sound of compressed nitrogen releasing, the sight of liquid fire cascading into underground positions, the terrible heat that ended lives in seconds, the reverberations that would sound through military history forever. The warrior's age had ended in flames across a Pacific island. The age of technological warfare had begun.